We love Zencaster because it allows us to record the audio for our podcast and create the video segments we use for our weekly Sister Scoop episodes. Zencaster has helped us make content capture simple.
It's now super easy to record a podcast with Zencaster. Log in using your browser and start recording a high-quality podcast right away. Record studio-quality sound and up to 4K video with your guests, and feel a sense of zen knowing Zencaster's multi-layered backups ensure you always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable.
If you've thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencaster's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast in one place and distribute it to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations.
Just go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code SistersAssembled, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. We want you to have the same easy experiences we do for all of our podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story.
Katie and I are always hungry, and one snack we both love is beef jerky. That's why we're so excited to tell you about one of our favorite jerky brands, Matt Hat Jerky.
Matt Hat's delicious taste makes it a great snack, and the variety of flavors, including original, black truffle, and my personal favorite, roasted garlic, means there's a flavor for everyone. Plus, it's local to the area where we grew up in, which we just love.
Use the link in the show notes below to get some Matt Hat Jerky for yourself, and make sure to use our coupon code SistersAssembled for 10% off. Hello and welcome to Sisters Assembled, your home for all things MCU, and in this case, all things MCU adjacent, because we are going back to Venom and talking about some of the offshoots, or taking deeper dives, really, into some of the offshoots of Venom: The Last Dance, since we had to take a quick little pivot and talk about Agatha 8 and 9 last week. Now, with that being said, we're going to give you a little bit of background on the King in Black storyline, which seems to have been set up by Venom: The Last Dance, and give you some predictions for how it may or may not tie into future MCU or Sony Spider-Verse crossovers and movies and things like that, because that seems to be the potential direction we're going. So, with all that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Katie, and she's going to kick off the episode.
Let's start with Knull himself, because I think if you don't really know much about the lore behind this, we're going to get really confusing. Because I'm already starting pretty confused with what I've read and what I've researched. So let's start with the man of the hour, which is Knull. We were introduced to him for the very first time on the big screen in the latest Venom and the finale of the trilogy. If you haven't seen it, whoopsie, that should have been a warning. Y'all should have kind of read the title to this episode. But we were introduced to him very briefly. We saw him at the beginning and end, or more beginning and was it an end credit? Whatever. That was it. Didn't really fully see a face. We know who's actually playing him, but doesn't really matter. He's still in prison as far... Well, I said Taylor's giving me a face. I mean it because the guy who's actually playing him, whose name is blanking suddenly.
Andy Serkis.
Yes, thank you. I knew it was Serkis. I couldn't remember his first name. Obviously has already been in the MCU, but because of the intense amount of makeup Knull has, you can't tell. So that's kind of what I was saying when it doesn't really matter that there's a crossover. There were more parts of that conversation that happened in my head. But anyway, moving into who Knull is. Let's just start with the obvious. He's primarily a Carnage and Venom villain. This is who you'll find him most associated with. That shouldn't be shocking. But some weird names pop up on the other rosters of enemies he has, primarily Thor and Silver Surfer.
Yeah, he just pulls from all areas of the MCU.
Oh, yes, as we get further, especially specifically into the King in Black storyline, like, this becomes chaotic at best. Like, that's the best way I can describe this. But I do want to point out that the reason he's one of Thor's villains is actually because of Gore the God Butcher, which I thought was just kind of interesting because obviously we've seen Gore, that's been played out, but we have seen him on the screen. And so it's a little interesting that that's part of this story a little bit. But going into more of a rundown, I do have to say he's described as one of Marvel's most powerful supervillains that exists. So keep that in mind as we talk about him. He also created the weapon All Black, the Necro Sword, and he's also, and this was actually pretty true from the movie, the father of the symbiotes and the Exelons. He's created those alien races. But what's really interesting is kind of how he comes about, which this is like buzzword central this episode, because this is going to get crazy.
It's a who's who of characters.
No, it really is. So, to start with, he's a primordial deity. And this all starts pretty much, there's like sixth and seventh, like cosmos things. And we're not going to get into that part of the details because that was a little too in the weeds for me. But essentially, the Celestials come around and gave him the King in Black title, which is essentially the job to look over their creations. Buzzword, guys, the Celestials, who we haven't fully seen since Eternals, which the second one was canceled. So we don't really know where that's going right now. But oh, wait, we saw them in Thor Love and Thunder. There you go. Anyway, so when the Celestials move forward with creating what we will eventually know as the Marvel Universe in the comics, and now technically also the movies, he was awakened by the light of creation, which pretty much really, really annoyed him. Just think, he's like a dark emo guy. Like, he hates the light.
But also, can we just talk about the fact that his villain origin story is that someone basically opened the blinds and woke him up from a nap?
No, literally. He was like, "Are you freaking kidding me? You told me it would be dark this whole time, and instead, let there be light? What is this?"
Is this not the most relatable villain origin story of all time?
I fear he might be me. I don't know. But yes, that is essentially his villain origin. If we were to explain a plot badly, that is exactly how that went. And in doing so, he turned on the Celestials, ends up killing one of them, and soon our supervillain has been created.
Can I just add one piece of detail that I think is super important and super, super interesting?
Yes, you can.
The name of the Celestial that he murders is none other than Nowhere, who also already exists in the MCU and is the floating head that we have seen in the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise.
Correct. And that has actually been one of the biggest loose ends, really, since the beginning of the Guardians, because haven't we all always asked, like, where or who killed Nowhere? Like, how did he become a giant celestial head just floating in space? So it kind of could be cool if this is retroactively put back and it's like, oh, but actually it was Knull like millions of years ago.
Which would be crazy because if you look at the timing, right? Guardians came out 2014, 2015, and almost 10 years later, they introduced Knull in the Sony verse. So it's like a step removed and potentially giving us the background for why or how that actually came about. So I love stuff that like is a soft retcon from like a million years ago, but doesn't actually affect anything. Like it just adds more depth to the story. So I'm actually a huge fan if that's something that they're able to integrate.
I think it would be really cool. I like when loose ends are tied up, and I know I'm sure plenty of people kind of write off Nowhere and don't really care too much to know. We are not those people.
No.
Like, we have pretty much, even before the podcast, it's always been like, I wonder who killed him. Like, how'd we get here? It's just a floating head of a celestial. And then obviously they introduced Ego. So I think that made that question arise during Guardians 2 as well. But to kind of wrap up, if we go to the very end of Null's story, because there's a whole lot of crap that happens in the middle, we're going to talk about King of Black specifically. So I'm not going to get into the rest of the details. But Eddie Brock actually ends up taking the King in Black title. We'll talk about how this comes about through the King in Black storyline. But what's really important to note is that that title and that job essentially is the equivalent of the purpose of the Beyonders, which is really, really interesting because that's something we've been also mentioning over the past year, year and a half. So I think that was kind of an interesting thing that we can go into more detail for. But lastly, to give a quick rundown on Knull and his abilities, because he's a little scary. He is immortal. Obviously, he is a deity. Superhuman strength. He can generate and manipulate eldritch darkness, which, from my understanding, is like if you look at the Scarlet Witch with her chaos magic kind of idea. He can just make things appear out of thin air. He can shapeshift. He can fly. He has regenerative healing. And he has remote power over all symbiotes, which I think is really something interesting to keep in your mind and in your back pocket as we move forward.
Yeah, so that was a really good rundown. He is definitely a super, super interesting character. I think one of the things that kind of surprised me the most when I was doing research on this particular storyline and Null himself is just how intrinsic he seems to so many different characters. Not intrinsic, but how involved he is with so many different characters. Because truthfully, like up until a couple of weeks ago when they were talking about King in Black, and we'll get to this, but when they were talking about King in Black potentially being the title of Spider-Man 4, I had never heard of the King in Black storyline or really even Knull himself. I mean, I know at that point, like, they were starting to release it in Venom trailers, so, like, it was starting to, percolate a little bit online. but it was not like, oh, I knew the Silver Surfer, or I knew, Galactus, and like all these names, or like obviously Magneto. Like, even from being a kid, like this is not a character that if you're just a casual MCU fan or somebody like us who occasionally picks up the odd comic book for fun, that you're gonna know. Yet he is so involved, and this King in Black storyline, which when we get into it you'll see, is so massive and involves so many characters, and it's a really huge crossover that I think, unless you're really paying attention to that world, you might not know about, but has real potential to be something very big when it's adapted for the screen.
It does, and that's actually something I know Taylor and I both talked about prior to recording, was how big this actually is. To a great point that you just made, if you aren't really wrapped into a lot of this, you have no idea. And I would like to correct a statement we were talking about during our Venom reactions, and I think prior to that actually as well, because there were rumors that Spider-Man 4, and we'll get to this in more detail, but there were rumors Spider-Man 4 could be King in Black. I just want to at least put it out there before we go into this entire storyline that we're starting to solidly think that's not going to be true because of how big and involved the storyline is. If you go that route, I think it's going to be severely watered down.
Agreed. It would be actually, what would be a really good parallel for it? Secret Invasion.
Oh,
That is a
yes.
massive storyline in the comics that we got whatever we got last summer. And that was so disappointing. I seriously implore you guys, if you have not, and I haven't had a chance yet either, but if you have not at least done your research on what Secret Invasion truly is and who it truly involves in the comics, and then you see that show, it is just so pared back. It's like a shadow of what the actual comic is like. And I think that is my biggest fear, is that if this does become, the Spider-Man 4 plot line, that's the blueprint they're going to follow, is paring back so much of the storyline. I mean, we don't have an Eddie Brock in the MCU, and as you'll see when we go through a quick, plot synopsis of this storyline, it's really about Eddie. Like, Peter Parker is involved, don't get me wrong, but Eddie is the one who saves the day. Eddie becomes the King in Black. So that is my concern, is that we're going to essentially Secret Invasion this and make it super weak when it actually has the bones to be something really, really big, and kind of like an Avengers level movie. Like, not even just like 2012 Avengers. It should be like an Age of Ultron level movie. If not, and I know some articles were talking about this too, it could even be like the next phase is moving towards a Knull. Now, that's a lot of collaboration between the two studios, but I mean, it has the legs to do that. It is a worldwide threat, as you'll see. So I cannot emphasize enough, like, how big this storyline truly is, and what an absolute waste it would be to use it on a singular film that is not of the caliber of like an Age of Ultron, or even a Civil War that has so many of the characters involved and has such major ramifications.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I do want to table it for our last segment when we get into kind of what we think the future is and if King in Black will be something we see actually come to full fruition. Let's get into the plot of this so we're not dancing around it, so you all can kind of see why we have the sentiment that we have. So I'll let T take this one since I did a whole rundown on Knull at the beginning of this episode, so she could take away the entire King in Black storyline.
This feels like an uneven division of labor, but here we go. Alrighty, so 30,000-foot view of the King in Black plotline. Essentially, without going too deep into this part, because I don't 100% know how it happens. I do know, but I don't 100% understand. And it also technically takes place before the King in Black actual plotline begins, but it sets everything else up. There's this cult, and they still, think Knull is a god. This is a cult on Earth, and they actually go ahead and grave rob the body of Cletus Cassidy, aka the Carnage symbiote, and Carnage goes and helps free Knull. And that kind of all happens to set up King in Black. There's a lot of stuff with codexes and stuff that I don't really want to get into, but that is the quick and dirty of how that happens. So once Knull is freed, he finds the location of Earth, or he's actually given the location of Earth, and he comes to basically take it over. And he comes with these symbiote dragons, which intense, and he basically covers the earth in like the symbiote material, blocking out all of the light. And so once he does this, obviously the heroes have to kind of mobilize. And I just want to get into this list of characters here of everybody who's like involved. And not this isn't even everybody, but these are just some of the main characters. So you have Eddie, we talked about how he's kind of the main guy for this particular storyline. Then he's working with the Avengers, he's working with the Fantastic Four, the X-Men are defending Krakoa and they are involved. So that's just the heroes, right? Like we just named 3 of the biggest teams that exist in Marvel Comics. 1 and 2, all 3 of those teams, okay, well not quite the X-Men yet, but we know they're coming. All 3 of those teams either are or will be in the MCU within the next 3 to 5 years. I think that's a safe bet to say, right? So they are all kind of working together. Sentry comes. Sentry, if you have been listening to any of our slight talks about Thunderbolts in our Sisters Scoop segments, you know that he is likely, not 100% confirmed, but everybody kind of knows, going to be in that film. So he is actually there. He gets ripped in half. He's murdered. So that
Yay,
happens.
Sentry.
Poor guy. He's like one of the most powerful people, and he just absolutely gets annihilated. A lot of our heroes are actually, taken over by symbiotes, but not in the cute, like, Venom and Eddie, we low key love each other way, but like hive minded symbiotes way. When Katie mentioned that Knull has this connection with symbiotes, that's what it is. It's a hive mind. So they're all able to, be controlled by Knull, but also feed back information to him. So he just basically has like hundreds of thousands of eyes and ears, which is horrifying to think about.
For anyone who needs any kind of reference to that, just think of Stranger Things. That's all you got to know.
Still haven't watched that show.
Okay, so anybody who's not Taylor, who has
I
watched
know.
Stranger Things,
I know.
because, it's like a cultural phenomenon. Anyway, that would be a great reference to the hive mind idea and how the eyes and ears kind of translate back to the bigger source.
Yes. And so essentially then Eddie goes and he kind of gets killed. Well, he does get killed, but because the codexes are different in the comics than they are and the way that they've been, introduced to us in the Venom 3 film, he like becomes, his essence lives on through the codex and he becomes part of the hive mind. So he actually is like fighting Knull from the inside. There are other people who are fighting Knull from the outside. Long story short, a lot of battles later, Eddie kills Knull and he becomes the King in Black. One side plot that I think is super interesting because it does lend a little bit to the idea that this could be Spider-Man 4. And again, we'll get to that in a second, why we do or don't think that. But I do want to point out at least why this could be the right time for the King in Black storyline, whether that is a larger film or Spider-Man 4, is because this is during Wilson Fisk's term as mayor, and he kind of is a turd about it.
Of course it is.
I know.
Like, you can't make this up.
It's all the pieces are coming together. That's all I'm going to say. He doesn't really do a great thing as mayor. I think he doesn't like evacuate the city, which of course New York's the epicenter because naturally, but I'm pretty sure he just doesn't evacuate and refuses to kind of help. However, the one thing he does do is create the Thunderbolts. So I just wanted to point that out, that that's a little side plot that happens during this King in Black storyline. So that is a very, very abridged version. When I tell you I was reading the same article for over 10 minutes because of all of the people that are involved, Namor is involved. I'm pretty sure it's like extra bad symbiote wise in Wakanda. Like basically you cannot have been a person in the comics on the earth who is named basically in the comics and not be involved essentially. I mean, Ghost Rider's involved. He's actually like interrogating Mephisto or something at the time. Like when I say everybody and their brother, I mean everybody and their brother. There's 1,000. It's one of those things kind of like Secret Wars where you have the main storyline and then 1,000 subplots. But that is the most abridged version of King in Black. Essentially, net, Knull comes, covers the earth in black goop. He wants to be darkness. Eddie kills him, becomes the King in Black, but like benevolent kind. And all of our heroes have to like work together and a bunch of people get attacked and taken over by symbiotes.
Yeah, I wanted you to cover that because I read also the same synopsis about 14 times. And I was like, who did what and who's now what and what is happening?
And where are they?
Yeah.
And what are they covered in? And what symbiote are they now a part of?
And to your point, you have all these people, like it's name drop central. I know something I even wrote down was there were symbiote possessed celestials, including Arishem. He was one of them in this story. So, like, I wrote when I was writing my notes, I was just writing things that I was like, what the crap? And that, was
my
essentially
notes
one of them.
too.
Yeah. I was like, okay, that's just going to be one of them because Arishem's just out here, being somehow possessed by a symbiote. Didn't know celestials could be possessed by anything. They are above deities. Remember, we did a whole, like, I don't even know, was it like a triangle, like hierarchy thing? And we were like,
oh yeah.
yeah, these people are here and these people are here. So, but I think celestials are at the top. Apparently, symbiotes top celestials, Knull top celestials. I don't know. I guess he has to be in a league of his own. But that was one thing I had written. Another thing I kind of had just for reference written down was a huge subplot to this as well. And Eddie's driving force is actually his son is involved in this story as well. Obviously, where we know Eddie to be at right in the current moment, doesn't have a child, doesn't have a significant other in which he would have a child with at the present moment. But he is driven by the fact that Knull really wants his son. I honestly cannot tell you why. There was a whole lot happening. But that was one of the things that was getting Eddie really driven to take him down as well, beyond just the invasion. But his son, to my knowledge, I don't know if he had his own symbiote or what, but he also could sense Knull was coming. Because Eddie was essentially Paul Revere, guys. He was running around the streets, Knull is coming. Knull is coming. Like, that is how this whole thing starts, is he's like, hey, Avengers, hey, everybody else, he's on his way. But his son also senses it. So I'm not really sure the story behind that. But that is another big factor as well.
Yeah. I mean, this storyline, let's talk about complicated. Like, there is just so many elements to it. And another thing that I think I forgot to mention in my name drop central review of it was the other person who's like actually pretty prominent in this storyline who has been kind of sidelined since the whole Celestials property has not really moved forward is actually Black Knight. Because Knull is driven by wanting the ebony sword. So that's super interesting as well. Honestly, like all King in Black theories aside, I do hope that like if they move forward with this and it becomes, a larger film, that this is reason for them to continue the Celestials and like Eternal storyline because a lot of those, I mean, you mentioned Arishem, I mentioned Black Knight, like those characters are important to the MCU and other plot lines. And I mean, we've talked about it at length. We both liked the Eternals film and would like to see another one. And I know, they have their feelings over there at the studio about it. But I hope that this is like, if they do decide to do this and they do it well and at the level it's supposed to be, that it gives them that reason to continue with those characters. Because I think right now what they're able to do is just be like, oh well, there's nothing that really involves these guys, so we don't really need to bring them back. They kind of live in a bubble. But if we're doing storylines, major storylines where they are important, well, now let's bring them back. And that gives us the excuse to have another Eternals film, which I think, there are a lot of people who genuinely liked it. And I think the people who didn't were just a little bit louder, unfortunately.
Yeah, there are also other stories we've talked about over time that I think involve those types of characters, including the Eternals themselves. So I do think hopefully that would be something that pushes it forward. But I want to get into what we really think is going to happen here. Opening the doors back up to the conversation we closed earlier, just so that we could actually tell you guys the very, very wide scope and idea of the story itself. This is a lot. If you guys haven't gotten that, this is a lot. To even attempt to put this into a Spider-Man 4 is insane.
Yeah.
Not to mention, you'd be putting it in, and I say Spider-Man 4 in the sense of he's supposed to have a whole other trilogy, guys. Let's not forget that. This isn't the end of a trilogy. This is what they would arguably be using to begin his second trilogy, in which we all argued should be ground level. Does this sound ground level to you? It doesn't sound pretty ground level to me. So that's its first problem as far as I'm concerned. Second, it's too big. If you want to tell the story right, you got to involve all the right players. You can't do that. And now I know Sony wants multiversal. Has this not been the debate for months at this end? Like, we know Marvel wanted one way, Sony wanted another. Now it seems like they've compromised, but it's still going somewhat multiversal. We see what Venom just set up. And I'm not mad Venom set it up, but I am now sitting here concerned. I'm a little worried because this shouldn't be the direction I think it goes. I really don't think we need Knull in this movie. Not yet.
I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that there's a few other things that I want to add. So, first of all, let's get something straight. If we haven't emphasized this enough, I just want to lay it out, I think, for probably the third time this episode. King in Black, while involving Peter Parker and Spider-Man, because he is wearing the black suit, and that is another part of my qualm here in a second, or at least my larger timing theory. While he is wearing the black symbiote suit during this ordeal, he is not the main character, or he would be the guy who kills Knull and becomes the King in Black. But it's not. It's Eddie Brock. He is the true, central hero of this storyline. So that does not belong in a Spider-Man 4 because a Spider-Man 4 should be focused on Peter Parker. Okay, qualm 1. Qualm 2. We do not in fact have an Eddie Brock at all anymore. Yes, Tom Hardy has said that he admires Tom Holland's work as Peter Parker / Spider-Man and that he is the Spider-Man he would like to fight. That's great. They're not super fighting each other in this storyline. They're actually on the same team. 1. 2, it does not make sense for him to come over, I guess, because this is I guess what I'm trying to say is I cannot see this Eddie Brock being the guy who takes on Knull in this way, because I think it would be better served to be the Venom from 616 and the MCU. I really do. I just don't think that in my head, it doesn't make sense for Tom Hardy's Venom to be the one who makes this jump, even though, yes, he's the one who brought Knull in, essentially, and brought him into the big screen. It was his franchise. I just don't know that I see him making this jump over when Tom Hardy has said that unless he's fighting Spider-Man, he's done. It just seems like there's a little bit too much dissonance there. 3, I totally agree with you that it does not fit for a Spider-Man 4 for a beginning of a trilogy for a couple of reasons. 1, I do think it should be more ground level. I think that makes way more sense for where the character just was. They took him to the height of the multiverse and then they stripped that all away. So I sincerely hope that they find a way, to make this work from a ground level perspective and between the two studios, competing desires and objectives for this film. 2, the next thing I want to talk about, as I mentioned before, he is the black suited symbiote Spider-Man.
Wait,
Literally,
isn't this point 4?
Well, I don't know. I don't even know how many points I'm at.
I think that's 4, not 2.
However many points I'm at, I don't know. I've lost count.
Okay.
But I have a lot of qualms. Not because I don't want to see this, because I do want to see it adapted. I just think it needs to be done the right way. However many points this is, whatever number we're at, he is the black suited Spider-Man. It's literally called Symbiote Spider-Man, King in Black. So he needs the symbiote, which, as we've talked about in past episodes, could be done in Secret Wars, right? The original Secret Wars in 1980 is the first time we ever see Spider-Man in the black suit, in the symbiote suit. The other opportunity, as we know, and as was confirmed in Venom 3, the piece of Venom that was left in 616 at the end of, I want to say that's No Way Home, it was confirmed in this film that the bar that Strickland, who by the way is in the King in Black storyline, just FYI, the bar that Strickland goes to is in fact in Eddie / Venom's universe, not in 616, which means that piece of Venom still exists in 616. So there's 2 opportunities for him to get the black suit, but those need to happen before Spider-Man 4. It is unclear to me if Spider-Man 4 is happening before Doomsday and or Secret Wars because they are starting to film next summer.
It is. I'm pretty sure they gave it a 2026 date.
There you go. I wasn't sure exactly if they'd given it a date yet, but that makes sense.
I'm not sure if it'll be before, because isn't Doomsday technically at the beginning of...
I think it's May. It's the May release, I think.
So
right?
Unless it's the early release in February, it's going to be between the 2.
Okay, which works because again, Secret Wars. But the big thing that I'm trying to get at here is I think Spider-Man 4 needs to happen before Secret Wars. And if that's going to happen, then he's probably going to get the black suit either at the end of his own film or in Secret Wars, in which case, that would then, when we do the soft reboot, set us up for King in Black. Now, I kind of take back a little bit of what I said about Eddie and Tom Hardy's Venom not being the Venom for this storyline. If we do a post Secret Wars soft reboot, there are opportunities for characters to kind of all mesh into one universe. In the comics, that's how Miles Morales moves from the Ultimate Universe to 616 and the main continuity. So you could do something similar with Eddie, and now he's set up to be with Tom Holland's Peter Parker, and they can play out this full King in Black at an Age of Ultron level Avengers film, or this could be the next big bad. We talked about it at the top of the episode. Katie emphasized it. He is one of the most powerful big bads out there. So if you're doing something shorter or whatever it might be, you're not ready quite yet for the X-Men to be the next trilogy or trilogy of phases, this could be a short one you could do. Or again, he could be a smaller Avengers film in between, but it does need to be an Avengers level film, not Spider-Man.
Listen, I don't disagree with any of the 17 million points you just had because you lost count and I lost count.
Look, they were all valid.
I'm not saying they're not. I think they were all valid and they were all correct. Here's my qualm. I use it with singularity because, one, you kind of shared a lot of the ones I also had concerns with. But two, I think this is the only one that matters. This is somewhat, somewhere, with some touch of it, going to be a Sony-led film.
Yup.
And that alone has me stressed. I gave them their credit for Venom 3. I did. You all heard it if you watched our reactions episode. I gave them the credit. It was a good movie. Were there things I didn't love about it? Yes. Still a Sony film. So, you know what?
Put
it
it
has
in
its limitations. Yeah, but it was still a very good movie. I would genuinely watch again. But I am so concerned, especially knowing that if this is what they're going to end up pushing for, that scares me. And I think if I wasn't also worried about the fact that, let's be real, guys, like we always talk about Spider-Man being fought over, but at the end of the day, all these other characters Sony's making these other movies about are also still shared by Marvel. Marvel can use them if they would want to, but there has to be 9 million discussions behind the scenes that have to happen, but it's possible. So at the end of the day, if Marvel says, yeah, you know what, we like this idea, let's go ahead with it, that's Sony bringing to the table their Eddie Brock. I don't think it'll be another one if this is what they want to do, because you just spent an entire 6 years building a trilogy behind this character. Why would you waste my time trying to introduce me to another one?
Fair.
Well, and I think it's only because it's Sony. I think they're going to sit there, and I logically get it. It's like, I built this whole story. Why would I waste my time? But they'd want it to be Tom Hardy. Here we go. We all followed him through the rest of his story. Why would I learn a whole other Venom and Eddie and all that crap? Because nothing's going to be as impactful as a 3-movie character I spent all this time with. I spent, 7 hours with this man? Like, I know this character. I just think knowing that the other big character that would be on the screen would be Eddie Brock, and that at this point has been Sony's character and Sony's take, I am concerned. That is my concern overall. That, and again, it's just a Sony movie.
Yeah, I think that that's probably like concern number one. The rest of it about doing the comic justice and, how does it fit within the larger timeline all kind of fall secondary to this one. Because if you think about it, even if this is an Avengers level film, right, which at the baseline, that's what it needs to be to avoid the secret invasion trap, which is, I just coined it right here. This is my new thing for things that are not done to the level that they should be, the secret invasion trap. So to avoid that, this needs to be at least minimum an Avengers level film. I really struggle. Obviously, Spider-Man's been in Avengers level films, but this would be a Sony-led storyline, to your point. And I really struggle with the idea of Marvel giving Sony an Avengers level film, or giving them the creative power over so many of the characters that would need to be involved. Like, can you imagine Marvel saying to Sony, oh, hey, here's Pedro Pascal and the Fantastic Four, you can work with them, or here's, whoever they're going to get as the new Wolverine and the new Cyclops and the new Jean Grey, you can have
Well,
all
that
of
was kind of
them.
my other point, was like, you then have all the Marvel characters that need to be involved in this. Like, this would be the first time these studios have to genuinely work together fully with all of their characters. And I just don't see that happening.
No.
My bigger thing, I think if they're going to do this, it's getting watered down. And that's my biggest concern.
And that is a waste, and that is honestly so disappointing. Like, if you are going to secret invasionify it, then don't do it at all, because this is too interesting and too involved a plot line for you to have your little war over characters and IP and not be able to work collaboratively. Don't waste the plot. Wait, Marvel, until you can buy the characters back from Sony. Like, I would rather wait 5 years for them to buy. I don't even know if that's real or if they're ever going to do that, but I'm just putting that out there. Like, I would rather wait for them to buy the characters back and have full control, exactly like they did with the X-Men, and do exactly what they want to do, versus like basically doing a half job on this one because they have to, work with Sony and this is their storyline that they set up. Like, do it well or don't do it at all. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a better way to tie a bow on it than to say that. It's a big storyline, guys. Do not let that be something you don't come out of this episode understanding. If you want to really get into it, go read up on it. Try your best to get through all the characters that are involved. But honestly, just read a synopsis. Even go on the Marvel Wiki or whatever, because there's a lot to it. And I hope by you doing that and understanding it a little bit more, you'll understand why it doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to do it in Spider-Man 4. Quite frankly, right now, it doesn't make sense to do it anywhere across the board, especially when you have an Eddie Brock who supposedly is done unless he fights Spider-Man. Like, it doesn't really make sense anywhere. Putting that aside, I'm excited if it ever happens. I am. I just want it to be done right. I want it to be shown the way it should be. Don't give it a title and just be like, this is what it's called, but it's nothing like the comic. I would be excited to see it happen on the big screen, though, if it's possible.
Yeah, it would be great. I just don't do what you did to Secret Invasion. Like, use that as your cautionary tale, because so many people really put that as the lowest show. And I think part of that is just the expectation of what that is and what that exists as the comics. And this is another, mega level crossover that deserves the treatment that that type of crossover gets. That's not to say it has to be completely faithful to the comics, because we all know that they sometimes play fast and loose, and that's fine. Some of those things are not, directly translatable to movies or television and they need to be changed. That's fine, but keep the integrity and the level of intensity and complication, maybe not the complication, but the level of intensity of this storyline, because otherwise you're stripping it of what makes it, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's all I gotta say.
Same here. Well, that is our King in Black episode. We will continue to provide updates as we find out more, hopefully, on Spider-Man 4. So make sure you're checking in with us. We'll definitely be adding those episodes as we see fit and as new information comes to light. But please make sure that you're following on your podcast platform of choice so that you can stay up with all of our new episodes and whatever we decide to dive deep into in the future. You can also check out the website and support the show if you would be so inclined to do so by clicking the link to our Buy Me a Coffee in the show notes.
Follow us on our socials, which are linked in the show notes below, including our YouTube channel where you can find our weekly Sister Scoop news segments. Those go up every week talking about the big 3 topics in Marvel news that week. So go ahead and give us a subscribe on there as well. Next week, we are finishing our Venom coverage with kind of the idea of what's next within the Venom franchise itself, where the movie left us, what our loose ends could mean for the future of Venom or the Venom franchise if Sony decides to go further with it. So we are going to be covering that topic next week. Stick around for that. It's going to be very interesting. We're going to talk about some different symbiotes. If you watch the movie, which again, you should have, you know exactly the one we're probably going to be discussing. She is currently my Fortnite skin. Anyway, make sure you guys tune in for that one because Marvel just blew your mind. So let's talk about it.